The silence of a closed, abandoned mine is not like the silence of an empty house. In a house, the quiet feels settled, almost peaceful, but deep within the earth, beneath millions of tons of jagged rock and forgotten soil, the silence is a heavy, crushing entity. It presses against your eardrums until they ring with a frantic, desperate hum. It suffocates the air, thick with the stagnant stench of wet rot, ancient rust, and iron-rich dust that settles like a film on the back of your throat. Down there, the dark isn't just the absence of light. It feels alive. It feels patient. It feels like a lung, slowly exhaling the cold, damp breath of the abyss right into your face. Every single drop of moisture hitting the muddy floor echoes like a gunshot through the empty shafts, a steady, rhythmic ticking clock counting down to something you aren't meant to survive. My name is the narrator, and tonight I am going to tell you about the job I should have never taken. It was late autumn when desperation finally broke me. My bank account was completely drained, the bills were piling up on my kitchen counter like a threat, and the bitter winter cold was already creeping through the cracks of my window frames. When I stumbled across the listing on a sketchy, anonymous online forum, it felt like a miracle. The title was plain: Night Surveillance Officer Remote Site. The pay was absurdly high, easily triple what any standard security firm was offering. There was no formal interview process, no background check, and no corporate drug test. Just a single, static, heavy phone call with a man whose voice sounded as dry and hollow as a gravel pit. He didn't care about my resume. He only asked one question: "Are you comfortable with absolute isolation?" The next morning, I found myself driving deep into the jagged, overgrown ridges of the northern Appalachian Mountains. The paved highway quickly gave way to a crumbling dirt road, which eventually deteriorated into an unmarked trail choked by dead leaves and thick brambles. The trees grew so densely overhead that they completely swallowed the daylight, plunging the mountain into a heavy, permanent twilight. When I finally reached the clearing, the sheer scope of the isolation hit me like a physical blow. Rising out of the fog was the skeletal iron frame of the Blackwood mining facility. It had been officially decommissioned in the late 1970s after a mysterious structural collapse, left to rot against the jagged rock face. My station for the next 12 hours was a tiny, rusted aluminum security booth perched near the main entrance, lit only by the sickly, flickering hum of a single fluorescent bulb. The man who had called me the site manager, an old, gaunt man named Miller, was waiting outside the booth. He didn't shake my hand. He didn't offer a polite welcome. His face was a map of deep, stress-carved wrinkles, and his eyes were completely bloodshot, darting anxiously toward the dark tree line every few seconds. He handed me a heavy iron ring holding a single, rusted key and a crumpled piece of yellow legal paper covered in a frantic, shaky handwriting. "The rules are entirely non-negotiable," Miller whispered, his voice barely louder than the freezing mountain breeze. "If you break them, do not call me, do not call the police, just pray. The end is quick." He didn't wait for me to ask questions. He climbed back into his truck and sped down the mountain road, leaving me completely alone with the heavy silence of the peaks. I stepped inside the cramped booth, smoothed out the wrinkled piece of paper under the dim light, and read the 2 rules that would haunt the rest of my days. Rule number 1, under no circumstances are you to ever cross the red iron gate at the back of the clearing. It is padlocked for a reason. Rule number 2, no matter what you hear, no matter how curious you get, never look at the internal camera feeds after exactly 2 o'clock a.m. By 1 o'clock a.m., the mountain air had dropped well below freezing. The cheap space heater on the floor of the booth groaned and rattled violently, doing absolutely nothing to cut through the icy draft seeping through the gaps in the metal walls. Outside, the fog had grown so dense that it pressed against the glass windows like a thick white wall, completely obliterating any view of the surrounding forest or the jagged mouth of the mine. The only proof of the outside world was the rhythmic, agonizingly slow sound of water dripping from the rusted iron rafters above the booth. Drop, drop, drop. I sat huddled in my jacket, my eyes glued to the bank of 4 ancient, flickering black and white monitors. 3 of them showed different angles of the external perimeter: the gravel yard, the perimeter fence, and the rusted red gate. The 4th monitor displayed the internal feed of Shaft 4, a deep, cavernous tunnel that had been permanently welded shut with thick steel beams decades ago. The screen was mostly static, a sea of grey grain showing nothing but the cold, jagged contours of the rock wall. Then, at exactly 1:15 a.m., the silence fractured. It wasn't a sudden crash. It wasn't the heavy thud of a stray animal or the wind blowing debris across the gravel. It was a long, low, metallic scrape. It sounded precisely like something heavy and jagged being dragged slowly across the solid rock floor. The sound was deep, vibrating through the concrete floor of my booth and rattling the plastic frame of my monitors. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I strained my ears, listening into the dead quiet that followed. There. It was again, closer this time. It was coming from the direction of the red iron gate at the back of the clearing. Panic, sharp and cold, flooded my chest. I grabbed my heavy maglite flashlight, my fingers shaking so violently I almost dropped it onto the floorboards. My mind raced, trying desperately to rationalize the noise. Maybe it was just a loose piece of sheet metal shifting in the wind. Maybe a wild animal was scavenging near the old equipment. But deep down, in the primitive, instinctual part of my brain, I knew that wasn't true. The wind had completely died down. The forest was dead silent. I forced my trembling legs to move, stepping out of the booth and into the freezing, wet darkness. The fog instantly swallowed me, wrapping around my skin like an ice-cold shroud. I raised the flashlight, its beam cutting a weak, yellow tunnel through the heavy mist. Every single step I took felt like a battle against my own body. The mud beneath my boots felt thick, heavy, pulling at my feet as if the earth itself was trying to hold me back. The sound echoed again, coming directly from behind the heavy fog wall. I pushed forward until the beam of my light finally illuminated the red iron gate. The heavy padlock was still completely intact, rusted shut and undisturbed. The thick chain was wrapped tightly around the bars, but as I lowered the flashlight beam toward the muddy ground beneath the gate, the air left my lungs in a sharp gasp. Freshly gouged into the wet earth and jagged gravel, extending directly out from the dark void behind the bars, was a deep, single trench. It looked as if a heavy, jagged piece of iron or a massive, malformed claw had been violently dragged forward from the depths of the mountain. The groove stopped precisely 1 inch before the boundary of the red gate. Nothing was there. The clearing was completely empty, but the overwhelming sensation of an apex predator staring directly at the back of my neck was so intense that my skin broke out in a violent sweat despite the freezing cold. I turned on my heel and sprinted blindly through the fog, locking myself back inside the aluminum booth, gasping for breath. As the digital clock on the desk shifted to 1:59 a.m., the digital numbers on the clock clicked over to 2 o'clock a.m. The moment the time changed, a profound, unnatural stillness settled over the entire mountain. The steady, rhythmic dripping of the water outside stopped instantly. The low hum of the fluorescent light bulb fell dead silent. Even the frantic rattling of the space heater died out, leaving the booth completely dark, save for the pale, ghostly glow of the 4 security monitors. Rule number 2 echoed through my mind like a scream. Never look at the internal camera feeds after exactly 2 o'clock a.m. I tried to look away. I tried to stare at the floor, at my boots, at the yellow legal paper on the desk. But curiosity is a poisonous thing when you are trapped in the dark. It whispers to you, convincing you that knowing the danger is safer than staying blind to it. My eyes slowly, inevitably drifted upward, locking onto the 4th monitor, the internal feed of the welded shut shaft 4. At first, there was only the familiar dancing, gray static. But then the static began to clear, the grain smoothing out to reveal a crystal-clear image of the deep subterranean tunnel. I expected to see a monster. I expected to see a pale, leathery creature or a towering shadow lurking in the dark. What I saw was infinitely worse. Deep inside the sealed tunnel, a light was moving. It was a faint, flickering amber glow, precisely like the flame of an old 19th century miner's lantern. It was bobbing slowly up and down, swaying with a gentle, rhythmic cadence, moving deeper from the pitch-black recesses of the shaft toward the camera lens. The light was entirely impossible. That tunnel had been completely welded shut with solid steel plates and iron beams for over 50 years. No oxygen should have existed down there to feed a flame. No human being could have walked those rotten, flooded passages, but the lantern kept coming. As it drew closer to the camera, the pale amber light illuminated the wet, jagged rock walls of the shaft. And then I saw the source of the scraping sound from earlier. Following directly behind the bobbing lantern, a massive rusted iron cable was being dragged along the stone floor, but there was no one holding the lantern. It was floating entirely on its own, suspended in the stagnant black air. Suddenly, the floating lantern stopped, dead in its tracks. It hovered just inches away from the security camera lens. The static on the monitor flared violently, screaming with a high-pitched, deafening electronic whine that pierced straight through my skull. Through the distortion, the amber light shifted. It didn't look like a flame anymore. It expanded, splitting into two wide, glowing, intelligent eyes that stared directly through the screen, directly through the camera lens, and straight into my soul. It knew I was watching. In that exact millisecond, the walls of my security booth began to vibrate. A violent, heavy thudding erupted from the ground beneath my feet, as if something massive was slamming against the bedrock from deep below. The scraping sound returned, but it wasn't coming from the red gate anymore. It was coming from right outside the booth. Something heavy, metallic, and impossibly fast was circling the aluminum structure, dragging its jagged weight against the metal exterior walls, leaving deep, screeching gouges in the frame. Adrenaline exploded through my veins, obliterating any sense of duty or sanity. I didn't grab my gear. I didn't turn off the monitors. I threw open the booth door and burst into the freezing night air. The fog was alive with sound. Dry, raspy whispers seemed to echo from the very dirt beneath my boots, chanting my name in a frantic, chaotic rhythm. I scrambled toward my car, my hands shaking so violently I dropped the keys into the freezing mud. I dropped to my knees, sobbing in absolute terror, blindly clawing through the wet dirt until my fingers wrapped around the cold metal key ring. As I scrambled back to my feet, I made the ultimate mistake. I looked back at the mine. Standing directly on top of the rusted roof of my security booth, towering over the clearing, was a shape. It was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and skeletal, completely devoid of a human face. In its hand it held a single flickering amber lantern, and its leathery, translucent neck was twisted entirely around, staring down at me with those wide, glowing eyes. I scrambled into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and cranked the engine. The tires screamed, spinning wildly on the wet gravel before finally catching traction. I tore down that mountain trail, smashing through low-hanging branches and deep mud pits, never once looking at my rearview mirror until I saw the bright neon lights of a 24-hour gas station on the main highway. I resigned the next morning via a brief typed text message to Miller. He never replied. He just sent my final paycheck through an anonymous wire transfer an hour later. I escaped the mountain that night, but I never truly left those woods. It has been months, but the horror didn't stay behind in the clearing. To this very day, I cannot sleep in total silence, because the moment the room gets completely quiet, the moment the dark settles into the corners of my bedroom, I hear it. A low, sharp, rhythmic, metallic scrape moving across my floorboards, a terrifying reminder that once the mountain knows your name, it never ever lets you go. If you have a dark truth or a story from the shadows that needs to be told, send it to me. And if you dare to face what lurks in the deep dark, subscribe to the narrators. Shadow, I'll be right here, waiting for you next week. Stay safe, stay quiet, and never look into the dark.